Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this really special occasion. I'm Stephen Sparks, along with my wife. I own Point Reyes Bookstore in Marin County, California. We're about an hour northwest of San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland. And I feel really grateful to be able to bring this group of people together tonight to talk about the work of a writer I really admire. I want to say a couple of quick thanks to Joel at the University of Texas Press for putting this together and organizing this, as well as to Ariana, Charlie, Francisco, and Alfredo for joining us, and for all of you in the audience. I see some names here, some people who knew Charles Bowden, Chuck to his friends, and so, I feel like we were just talking before, and I was like, how am I the one getting to introduce this special event? But I feel so grateful to Joel. And to the University of Texas Press. I think just a quick, I think of university presses along with a lot of small and independent presses as kind of seed banks. They preserve important cultural artifacts that may appear at the moment unfashionable or maybe ahead of their time. The work that these presses do, I think, is really valuable in advancing and sustaining our literary and scientific and artistic cultures. So a shout out to all university presses and especially University of Texas for taking they published this. We're celebrating today the completion of this Unnatural History of America series of books, beautifully bound. They stand out on a shelf, and they mean something, and they're valuable, I think, which is why Bowden's work resonates so deeply with a lot of us. And so for those of you who are here who maybe don't know as much about Bowden as our illustrious panel, I'll just say a quick intro to Charles. As I said, Chuck to his friends. Bowden was the author of scores of books, including A Shadow in the City, Down by the River, Juarez, The Laboratory of Our Future, and of course, Blood Orchid, An Unnatural History of America. Bowden was a contributing editor for GQ and Mother Jones, and also wrote for Harper's, the New York Times Book Review, and Aperture. He was the winner of a 1996 Lannan Literary Award for Nonfiction and lived at the end of his life in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Chris Kraus, writing in book form in 2017, said of Bowden, he was famously colorful and tough, practiced a rigorous, principled form of gonzo journalism, stripped of that genre's narcissism. In 2010, he said he hated the term journalist, calling it a gutless lying word for candy asses. I'm a reporter. I go out and report. I state the truth and give evidence. And sentences like that, I think, really kind of capture the essence of Bowden's work. And as Clara Jeffrey, who edited Charles Mother Jones for years, said, you have to be prepared to be clocked on the head when you read Bowden. Very brief intro to him. And so I'm going to introduce our panel here, and then we're going to get going. Ariana Reigns, joining us from New York, is the author of A Sand Book, 2019, Mercury, 2011, another book. Her play Telephone was produced at the Cherry Lane Theater and won several Obie Awards. Reigns was the 2009 Roberta C. Holloway Lecturer in Poetry at the University of California, Berkeley. She's taught masterclasses at Pomona College, the University of California, Davis, and the University of Pittsburgh. Ariana came through it to us tonight for the recommendation of Terry Tempest Williams, which led me to this amazing piece that Ariana wrote for Harriet, the Poetry Foundation blog, a few years back, and we'll hear a little bit about that tonight, I hope. Next up, we'll just go in order that they're appearing on my screen. Charles D'Ambrosio is the author of two collections of stories, The Point and the Dead Fish Museum, which was a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Award, and the essay collections Loitering and Orphans. He's been the recipient of a Whiting Writers Award and a Lannan Fellowship, among other honors. His work has appeared frequently in The New Yorker, as well as in Tin House, The Paris Review, Zoetrope, All Story, and A Public Space. And Charlie wrote the foreword for Jericho in this series of Unnatural History of America. Amazing piece of writing. Next up is Francisco Cantú. Paco was the author of The Line Becomes a River, Dispatches from the Border. He was an agent for the United States Border Patrol from 2008 to 2012, working in the deserts in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. A former Fulbright Fellow, he is the recipient of a Pushcart Prize, a 2017 Whiting Award, and the 2018 Art for Justice Fellowship. His writing and translations have been featured in the New York Times, Best American Essays, Harper's, and Guernica, as well as This American Life. Francisco wrote the foreword to a reprint of Bowden's Blue Desert, which was published, I think, a year or two ago by the University of Arizona Press, another university press keeping these works alive. And last but certainly not least, Alfredo Corchado is the Mexican border correspondent for the Dallas Morning News and author of Homelands and Midnight in Mexico. He's a Nyman, Lannan, US Mex, Woodrow Wilson, and Rockefeller Fellow, and is the winner of the Maria Morris Cabot Prize and Elijah Parrish Lovejoy Award for Courage in Journalism. Corchado is joining us tonight, and kind of the reason that we're gathering here is Alfredo's foreword for the book that kind of caps this series of the Unnatural History of America. And this is way too much talking for me, who usually just gets these things going and then disappears off screen. So we're gonna start. And I just want to ask Alfredo first, what brought you to Bowden's work, and why should we be reading it now in 2020?
Well, first of all, Stephen, thank you very much for the invitation and to be with such a great panel. Very honored to be here. I'm actually currently in El Paso, right on the border with Ciudad Juarez. And what brought me to Charles's work was, like any young journalist, I mean, you're looking for, who are the big writers, who to follow. This is before Twitter, obviously. But Bowden was the big name. I mean, he was the guy writing books, doing magazine pieces. He had also done quite as a laboratory of our future, which was like a must read for any journalist who was starting out and trying to understand the U.S.-Mexico border. One of the first poignant lines in Sonata is right at the beginning when Charles says, I realized I died too early. And over the last 6 years, that thought keeps running through my head is, where are you, Charles Bowden? I mean, the last 6 years have been an incredible roller coaster. He died a year before Donald Trump announced the candidacy for the presidency. I mean, we've gone through the debate about the wall, separation of families on the border, an asylum program where people have, remain and wait in Mexico. Obviously, the massacre of the shooting at Walmart in El Paso, and ongoing currently. I mean, what I'm covering more these days for the last 8-9 months now has been COVID-19, and how that has really transformed the entire border. And I say, I mean, his work is more relevant, I think, today, when you look at his writing and you question what is going on, and Charles wasn't off, in his writing and his views, the globalization and the ill effects of globalization. I mean, one of the stories I've been so involved with lately is the definition of essential workers. That's the big debate that we have these days. The maquila workers, the disappearance of women of Juarez, which is something that still continues. I mean, as of tonight, there are more than 2,600 people who have died from COVID just in the El Paso Juarez area. Obviously, many of them are essential workers. So I miss Charles Bowden.
Thank you for that. Charlie, would you mind going next? Tell us a little bit about what brought you to Charles' work.
Yeah. Oops. Is that making a really strange sound there? Hello? Okay, that's not.
Oh no. Well, wait. While we wait for Charlie to reconnect, Paco.
Sure. Yeah, maybe my introduction to Bowden's work is different because I think the first book I read by him was Blue Desert, and it's am I echoing or are we okay?
I think we're okay. I think it's Charlie's mic. We'll be fine.
Okay. Yeah, and you know, I had the privilege of writing a foreword for the reissue of that book, and so it sort of enabled me to revisit that book, because I think, you know, it's maybe his third official book, but I think it was one of his first kind of like big books with that I think started getting a big readership. It was published with the University of Arizona Press. And, you know, he was kind of in conversation, I think, with some of the other writers, the desert rat writers of his generation, like Ed Abbey. And so like that, so my introduction to him was more as a nature writer, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And, you know, I sort of fell in love with him as a desert writer, as a voice for, you know, who is very attuned to the tension between the beauty of the desert and the violence that plays out here. And you know, I think he wrote with such like clarity and ferocity about this era of, you know, just insane growth in the Southwest, in the Sun Belt. And I was in conversation with another desert writer, Gary Nabhan, the other day, and I did not know this, but you know, Gary says that is the largest human migration. If you look at both sides of the Sun Belt, you know, including the northern Mexico border cities, you know, sort of like including Las Vegas and all of these cities that like post World War II, that is the largest human migration that's occurred in our lifetimes. Which blew my mind, and also, you know, as Alfredo was sort of saying, just reminded me of, you know, the timeliness and the sort of like evergreen nature of the questions that he's asking and the things that he's interrogating, and then of course, you know, after that introduction as a younger person, I started spending more time on the border, working in the Border Patrol. I think like getting closer to that violence that he really interrogates in his work. And so I felt my relationship with his work sort of deepen in that way as I was reading through his later books. And I guess I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Hey, Charlie, let's try you now.
Okay. You know what? I'm still getting an echo on my end.
Do you have any other browsers open? Maybe?
I don't think so. I think I shut everything down, but maybe I... Oh, God.
Charlie, do you have headphones?
While we do that, maybe we'll move on to Ariana, if you, who brings an approach to this. I love what I was saying earlier, is that I love the diversity of this group of people who are bringing such different things to an appreciation of Bowden's work. Would you mind telling us a little bit about what brought you?
I don't mind at all. Although I'm really digging the echo, Charlie. I think we can work with it. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
I was living in a trailer on my friend's land, right on the edge of Santa Fe, and I want to say recovering from, but I was pretty much in the early throes of PTSD. It's a long story. I'm not going to go into it, but I couldn't really do much. And I asked my friend Bet Williams, who's a tremendous writer. I told her I needed something like of resurrectionary power. And she pointed me to Bowden. And I was broke, and so I read everything that I could find on the internet. And then at the time I was kind of like, I was doing a lot of work in Europe, which meant, you know, you sometimes wait 8 or 9 months to get paid, or long. It was just one of those deals where it was just like, I would go 6 months sometimes and there would be no money, and then I'd get my money. And I was kind of being shepherded by the like psychedelic lesbians of New Mexico, and between Las Cruces and Santa Fe and points in between, I was kind of moving up and down. And then my money came in and I ordered some books, and I like spent some really healing time in motels. And my first book was also Blue Desert, followed quickly by Blood Orchid, and then on from there. And I guess I'll leave it there. We're just talking about our gateway.
Yes, the gateway experience. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let's try Charlie now. I'm going to take off mute. Let's try this.
Okay, you know what? I believe it or not, I actually solved the problem, and I had a couple. It was being broadcast from several different browser windows. It was super psychedelic. So sorry, a little bit distracted. And now you waited, and I don't really have that much to say. I don't have like this kind of fancy story about Bowden. I was turned on to him probably in the late 80s by a friend of mine when I was late, like in 89 or so. I was out here at the Writers Workshop, in fiction, and a friend of mine who would later go on, Chris Hallman, who would later go on and writes a lot of nonfiction, said, "Have you ever read, this guy Bowden?" And the first thing I read was something in Harper's, and it was Torch Song. And generally I'm not a natural reader of nonfiction. I don't pick up nonfiction, but I love the personal essay. Love it. It's as close as I'll ever get to writing poetry. I think Bowden's like just an absolutely fabulous personal essayist. I kind of, I love the stuff in Blue Desert. I love the just to get myself in the kind of the Bowden mood. Read an essay that's in the Reader, which is an excellent kind of compendium of his stuff, called Snake Time, which is he just kind of slips into the point of view of a rattlesnake. And it's just amazing. So anyway, my interest is really his artistry as a personal essayist, and from there, I've never been to Tucson. I don't know that territory. It's all Bowden land as far as I'm concerned. But.
Well, that leads me to a question. In your foreword to Jericho, you write, we talk about Bowden's reporting and the point that he's telling these stories, as Alfredo mentioned, and you ask a question in the foreword, Charlie, to that book, saying, "For me, though, the stubborn question remains: why all this difficult business? Why the art, the vision, the wearying chase, when sturdy reporting and a simple byline will do?" And I wonder of each of you, what is it about that? What is it about this reporting that becomes art? And can you talk a little bit about the rhythm of the sentences and sort of the way that Bowden weaves these stories? Serpent, is included in Some of the Dead Are Still Breathing. It's about a rattlesnake that kind of takes up residence and they cohabitate together, on the porch in the home. Yeah. And all that is woven through these pretty harrowing stories about, the kind of the darkness that we're capable of. And so what is it, what is that compulsion to create art out of something so dark? Can you speak a little bit to that? Each of you, anyone, feel free to, I'm going to unmute so you can all jump in here. I'd be happy to hear from all of you.
Anybody want to, I can jump in a little bit, the same question could be posed to Orwell as well. And the thing about Orwell, enough time has passed. You can go back and reread that stuff and re-experience it because it is art. You never finally exhaust it, as opposed to the kind of a kind of more purely non-fictional mode where you can kind of do the extractive thing of just gleaning the information. And once you got the information, you never have to revisit the thing again. You're done with it. You've got it. You've got what you needed, and you're not going to return to it. The art compels sort of undergoing the experience. So you can, for me, I can reread, anyone's essays, but Bowden's in particular, and go through the experience all over again. It's Ezra Pound says, that art is news that stays news. A lot of what Bowden writes could have been written yesterday or tomorrow. It's going to stay news.
Right.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
You know, I find like the kind of a blend somehow of the KJV, the King James version of the Old Testament, and kind of the sick diagnostic ability of Charles Baudelaire in Bowdoin. And for me, I felt like discovering this writer and the sort of solemn ethic of the fact that he was making art as a journalist. For me, that was like a profoundly overwhelming American experience. It was a discovery, not only of the body of work, but he proves that it's possible to practice journalism on the level of biblical heft, I guess, and that kind of statistic that Paco mentioned about northern migration and about that human movement, that the immensity of it that's beyond what has been able to be understood in kind of what I call like ordinary journalistic consciousness. Like it's like the culture hasn't really come around to that yet, but it's happening, and that's why there's that once and future quality about his work. It feels both ancient and prophetic, and very, very present. And there's things that we could say about the style. Like, I wonder, I know there's people who are friends of Chuck's here in this space, and I wonder, like, was he funny? Like, did he ever laugh? Like, you know, was he a mean drunk? You know, what was he ever able to relax? I mean, a lot of questions, I guess. I feel like there's something deeply alluring and terrifying and also sobering about what his body of work proves is possible. Ethically, in terms of a sobriety of vision, in terms of commitment and fidelity to a beat. And all of those things, I think, blow a lot of thinner stuff out of the water for me. It's very, very humbling and somewhat terrifying for me to even contemplate.
Wow.
That made me think of, I feel like when I started to read more Bowden, and then actually, Charlie, you mentioned the reader, the Bowden Reader, which is great for those of you who are already Bowden fans, but maybe haven't seen that collection, because it collects a lot of his early journalism, and it collects just like a really wide range of articles that are, you know, more straight reporting, some stuff that's more you know, very much like a perfect specimen of personal essay, and then there's lots of excerpts as well from different books. And I think one thing that I realized as I was reading more and more of Bowden's work, and I think this is one of the great like rewards of being a Bowden reader or a Bowden fan, is that you will see the same scenes and the same moments, the same images pop up over and over again. And you know, like quite literally, you will see something go from a news article that he wrote when he was like at the Tucson Citizen, and then you will see it in, for example, Blue Desert. I'm thinking of, there's this, I think like a really foundational kind of traumatizing scene for him was this this murder that he had to report on in Tucson, where, you know, like a child was smashed against a wall. And you know, he writes about that scene again and again and again. And he writes about the first woman, the first name of the first woman that he read about in like an El Paso or Juarez newspaper who was a victim of femicide, you know, in the early days of femicide, 94, 95 or something. And he writes about that woman again and again and again. And I think like as writers, it can be, you know, like as students of Bowdoin or just as fans, you see that these questions that we have, you know, like we're allowed to ask the same question again and again. We're allowed to examine that same scene and that same moment in a different way, in a magazine piece, in a book that does one thing, in a book that does very much another thing. And so I think, you know, like Bowdoin helped me give myself permission as like a young writer to, you know, I don't know what Alfredo would have to say about this, but I feel like, you know, in journalism and in a lot of other kinds of writing, right, you're encouraged to do something new and different and move to the next thing and to the next thing. And I think Bowdoin very much resisted that, while at the same time, you know, his books feel so many of his books feel extremely distinct. You know, his writing never really feels stale. So that's something that I think about.
I mean, I think there's something about reinvention. I mean, we're all attracted to the border. I guess maybe I'm speaking more about as myself as an immigrant, of the idea of reinvention. And there's something about reinvention that's both beautiful and tragic. And it's almost like you're always going back to that border, back to that moment, trying to maybe fully understand the moment and the reasons and the whys. There's a part in Sonata where he says, you know, he's talking about the house of death, which is where, ironically, that was the time I first met Bowdoin. I doubt he really knew me. I mean, I was a young reporter. I was out trying to investigate the murder of these people who were being lured by U.S. agents, an informant. And I remember I saw him, and I later read his description of that moment where he says, you know, maybe this is a time I should have left. And yet we keep going back. I mean, 20 years after that moment, I mean, I still want answers, because there's so much mystery, there's so much cloud, even, you know, over time, we don't have that definitive answer. And so as a journalist, I remember when I first tried to transition to being an author, one of the first criticisms I got from the editor was, you have to be more dispassionate. You have to, you know, get off the sidelines. And I immediately started reading Down by the River, and that transitioning to really writing what you feel and how you feel, and less so about the whole nuance of trying to be objective. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, but I see Charles was attracted to the border for that. As me as a native Mexican, attracted to the border for the idea of reinvention.
Well, and this speaks too to me of his sort of willingness and to bear witness. Ariana, I hope it's okay if I read a paragraph from your piece in Harriet. I won't if you don't want me to, but I loved this because this speaks to, I think, this kind of, I won't say compulsion, I'll say like this.
You can read it. I just want to give a buyer beware, a caveat emptor, whatever. I have no idea what he's about to read. I was certainly in an altered state when I wrote it. And I need to take responsibility. Okay, take it away.
I'll take it away. But yeah, this speaks to, I think, that Alfredo, as you were saying, and to this idea of kind of bearing witness and not looking away. And as Paco, and as you talk, like you say, he kept coming back to these things because they were, you know, they were stories that needed to be told. And there was something that I think attracted him to the downtrodden in these overlooked stories. So this is what Ariana wrote, I'm guessing in the throes of having just read Charles Bowden. It's been a long time since I encountered a writer of such dignity. Many people stare coldly into shit. I mean, we all do. We do it every day. But I don't know where I've read prose so great-hearted it can describe the worst with such uncrazed warmth, or rather the great understanding it takes to actually go crazy in direct proportion to the impossible truth. Everywhere in his writing, you can feel his heart beating. And I think, you know, what I feel, and I hope you all have something to say to this too, is that part of the reason that we love a writer like this is that you do feel that great-hearted warmth and that willingness to kind of confront what is darkest and you know, most dangerous, and that it's not just to say it's not just reporting, but that it's that reporting and hearing these truths has an effect on us, you know, as writers, as readers. And so maybe, Alfredo, we can start with you. You know, as a journalist telling these stories, as an immigrant, you know, they obviously have an effect on you. I mean, people are dying now, you know, of COVID-19, and they've been dying crossing the border as a, you know, kind of a U.S. strategy. And you've told, I think, some of these stories in your books. But does that resonate with you in any way that Charles, that we love a writer like this because he does tell his story?
Yeah, you know, there's something about writing a story as from a first-person perspective and as a dispassionate journalist. I mean, one of the things I loved about Charles's writing was just the sense of clarity, the sense of being transparent about, you know, everything and anything he saw, not necessarily solving. And I think this is part of the beauty of going back, as Paco was saying, going back to the same story over and over again, is that you don't have the answers. You still have new questions. I mean, here we are, you know, 25, 30 years after when it was the beginning of the killing of women in Ciudad Juarez, something that Charles was very passionate about and something he was always questioning about, or the you know, the reasons why people get involved in drug trafficking, the questions, you know, asking it from both sides of the border. And I mean, I'm always curious in today's climate, how Charles would have written this era, the era of Trump, the era from, you know, I think sometimes some of us who are perhaps a little more hopeful about Mexico, I mean, Charles sometimes will write with this sort of gloom and doom view. I wonder how he would have written the story from the U.S. perspective, from this side of the border. And I think it would be the same transparency, the same kind of clarity.
Anyone else?
Yeah. You're muted. Why don't you go? I insist.
Okay, I was thinking about Alfredo's question. And, you know, I think like one thing that I consider a lot about, you know, in relation to how we as a country, like the national discourse about the border. I think in the last 4 years with Trump, you know, because of the sort of the nakedness with which, you know, to be honest, things that have been going on for a very long time, like policies and sort of dehumanized realities that have, you know, existed, like all the groundwork was laid for them long before Trump came, but Trump has sort of come, and I think like all of the you know, rhetoric is just stripped down to its most base level, and I think we're able to I think more people have been looking at what's happening here and seeing it for what it is and for what it has long been. That's not to say that things like haven't been worse under Trump, but it's also not to you know, like gloss over the fact that you know, I see the Trump policies as an extension of what came before them. And I think Bowden would have been really uniquely positioned. I guess I wonder like what he would do and what he would say to like all of these new eyes and this new attention to what's going on here. Because, you know, as somebody who, you know, like Alfredo, you wrote in your foreword something that I thought was interesting about being a journalist, and you say Americans were hungry for such grisly stories, reinforcing their views of Mexicans as bloodthirsty, and I was there feeding them daily as a journalist. And I think, you know, that Bowden grappled with that too, with the fact that you know, people often come to the border only when they're like looking for that horrifying or jarring story. And I think that as a myth is being constructed about Bowden and who he was and his work, you know, now in the years since his death, I think like we often see the myth that is being constructed around him and his work as this like hard, you know, he's writing about the violence, he's writing about like all the sort of horrors that are happening here. But he's also, and I think Sonata, it was so lovely to see a return to this kind of like blue desert, just like complete attentiveness to like the cranes and, you know, birds and the sky and just like the natural world. And so I think like Bowden, you know, while he would lean forward into like all the horrors of the Trump era, I think he was always grounded in this other sort of day-to-day reality of like the fact that there's a lot of joy here, the fact that there's a lot of beauty here, and I would have loved to hear him balance those two things in the Trump era, because I think it's something that I have a hard time balancing, and I think a lot of us have had a hard time balancing.
Yeah. It's hard for me to speculate about what he might have written about, you know, during this era. I really have no idea. You know, he seems like such a. At some point, he made a decision to go it alone. There's that element in Bowden, and so he would seem just naturally reluctant to join a chorus, and so much of like in the Trump era, you know, if you're kind of a liberal-minded, progressive-minded, whatever person, it's just kind of a, you know, you're just beating your head against a wall, but everyone else is beating their head against that same wall and making basically the same groaning sounds, I don't know, you know, and I think and I had to check this, but. Apparently, it is true that he kind of walked out in the middle of his defense of his dissertation, and to me that's the move of someone who is going to go their own way. Anyway, beyond that, I don't really, you know, I mean, I'm kind of begging off the question by saying I think he would have. He would have found you know, some other way rather than joining in. You know, I don't know if politics writ large was you know, his thing as somebody who kind of was you know, was getting his PhD at Madison during both you know, the 60s, so Vietnam and the Civil War, or not the Civil War, civil rights. You know. He didn't write about a lot of those things. He wasn't that kind of journalist, you know. He wasn't that kind of reporter. You know, I feel like as a writer, he had his own vision, and a fairly tragic vision of the world. So, which is not conducive to solutions. I mean, if things could be solved by better plumbing, you have social realism, but you don't have tragedy, I guess. You know. You know, anyway, I don't know what I'm saying, but I think he'd balk at the speculation about what he might write about. I think he would.
You know, it's interesting because a lot of his like political assessments, I think, were really astute. Like what, you know, the way he pointed out that the drugs always get through, no matter what. The way he pointed out that fundamentally, although it is a story of so much death and suffering, that overall the story of Northern migration is actually a story that continues to have a happy ending. He says that repeatedly all over his work. Mm-hmm. People get across and they make lives, and that's like, to me, that's a really interesting answer to the like liberal hand wringing of like my world in the Northeast, which is where I'm from, you know, where ideas about the border are progressive but abstract, mm-hmm. and where people don't have the experience in their bodies of what it feels like. But like the idea of no wall, but don't, you know what I mean? We don't know from experience in Massachusetts, where I come from, and I feel like there's also something about his like persona that I want to say, that there's something. I mean, I just have this memory of him in like a flak jacket saying the word lap dancer in front of Amy Goodman. And I just feel like I have to say that, because like you can't say lap dancer in front of Amy Goodman. Do you know? You don't do that. You don't do that. That's impolite. No. She is a saint. And he, there was just something, there was something in the performance also that I feel it's very interesting, because it was able to sort of break through a certain discourse. And this is another way of saying, you know, that, you know, the idea of joining the chorus, or of us all banging our head against the same wall, the quote unquote wall, the real wall. There's something there. I think there was a little bit of like I guess Chris Kraus said it, a gonzo. There was some performance art at work there. I don't know why I'm saying this. I just wanted to point out my favorite moment on Democracy Now! Ever.
You know, Stephen, if I can just add something, I mean,
please do.
One of the things that went through my head when you had this 21-year-old from North Texas who came to El Paso to stop the Hispanic invasion of Texas. I mean, I felt like I was reading Bowden all over again, like almost like he had prepared us for this moment. You know, with the invasion of migrants, the call for a wall, the globalization, and I felt like, you know, he was trying to tell us something over his years. You know, this was kind of the rage, the feelings in the homeland, in the United States, you know, towards Mexico and towards the border, and it just kind of collided on that August 3rd of 2019. I don't know. I still think of that moment, and I go back to some of his earlier writings. It's like he was preparing us for that moment.
Yeah. And something for me as a reader is that sense that that you're reading something that is telling as the sort of once and future. I love that phrase for his work. That it is granular reporting, and there is this focus on individual people and situations, and then there's also this like sort of relentless kind of self-excavation happening in these works that I've never quite seen it in you know, an essay that I've read about a murder, right? Like this sort of self-interrogation kind of reflects back constantly on Charles Bowden. And for you as writers, you know, in one of his projects, one of his stated projects was to, you know, write a history of his time, you know, sort of a Dickensian type thing. And of course, it's so specific to him and his moment and his geography. Then the four of you as writers, what do you imagine being a history of your time, you know, and not being so kind of grandiose that it's a history of the world, but it is a history of your time and your experience of the world, written through essays and books. Can any of you speak a little bit to what kind of, like, what an ambition like that would mean for you as a writer?
Stephen, this might be more in response to your sort of observation about his like self-interrogation. But I mean, maybe this is also an answer to the second part of your question as well. You know, like, what does it mean to write a history of our time? I mean, I think that part of the work that culturally is happening right now is, I think, like re-interrogating, you know, long accepted sort of like systemic institutional realities, but also sort of grappling with like the ways that we, you know, on an individual level in our day-to-day lives, sort of act those things out as well. And I think that, you know, as an admirer of Bowden and as somebody who, you know, I feel like he helped shape my literary sensibilities, like that is something that, as you mentioned, you know, he's very much involved in. I have the sense that he was involved in that kind of interrogation, you know, from the very beginning. Charlie mentioned Torch Song, which is, you know, like Bowden grappling in a really incredible way for like the early 90s, I think, when that was published, with masculinity, and with the violence of what we would now call, right, toxic masculinity, masculine culture. And I think Bowden is also somebody who gets criticized, and you know, often rightfully so, for the way that his prose is often shot through with that masculinity. But I think, you know, the thing that makes him a unique writer is that I think, you know, I think he, in interesting ways, felt like prisoner to a lot of different, you know, I think he felt prisoner to his masculinity. I think he felt prisoner to like being so captivated by violence, not being able to look away from you know, things like femicide. And I think that's part of our task, you know, now in this age, is like how to grapple with that in ourselves as a way to grapple with it more broadly.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting about the question of the masculinity. You know, one of the things I always think about you know, the work in general is that it's in this terrain that could be so macho. It's in this terrain that could be so gonzo. You know, it's in this terrain that could be so West, and he doesn't take it. He's there, but he does not pick up. He doesn't become that character. He doesn't kind of capitulate or kind of go. He does not go into the readily accepted form that's kind of available for someone who was kind of pursuing things at a pretty an extreme pace. He doesn't play like Hunter Thompson plays in a certain kind of way. You know, and because of that, the thing that eventually kind of seals the something about my rapport with the work is just kind of the utter darkness of his vision, which may account for some of the compulsive, the repetition, the need to kind of return again and again to things that don't have resolution or answers, or no, there's no easy out. So it can't become the macho character. You can't become the gonzo character. You know, it seems like a lot of the stuff in the whole unnatural history, most of the work seems almost like it's searching for a new form, a new kind of character, a new character for himself, a new kind of character on this kind of landscape that has ready-made characters, Western, you know, or whatever, almost like a more poetic form. I don't know, you know. It reads a lot of it reads really well in pieces, almost like standalone, you know, without the sort of coordination of narrative, you know. Anyway,
it reads like prose poetry, a lot of it, and it's musical in structure. It's full of refrains, and relentlessly, he is interrogating his own appetites and his own attractions while reporting on what he sees and what he hears and who he meets. And I think that double action is so rare. Mm-hmm. And as a reporter, part of what he's reporting on is his own drives, his own longings, his own obsessions. And you know, like Alfredo was saying, the allure of the border, he went there for renewal too, and self-diagnosed some of the weird problematics of that over and over. And it's interesting. I think the idea of a journalism that is reporting on its own proprioception or its own apprehension of what's true, that is a new form, I think. And so it's inspiring to me. I think, you know, it gives me what I look for in poetry, but it also, I guess there's something about the dignity of it that's very interesting to me as well, because I keep coming back to this, like, the irrevocable, like, I wish that we had his voice, you know, over the last 4 years, but I feel like one of the things his work taught me, and it gave me like a almost religious capacity to rest in a certain truth, is that no matter what bullshit we do, northern migration succeeds. It is always already to come and must happen, and it's a statistical fact. And this country, the tenor of what America has been, he said it would change. There's this kind of the immensity of that, and the way that it's a war and a disaster and a catastrophe and a thousand times in very particular and minute ways, a heartbreak and a life destruction, that overall the exodus succeeds. And that fucking anyway, so much of our southern territory is Mexico. I mean, there's a deep joy in that somehow, an almost psychedelic joy. It's late my time, so I'm starting to, you know, break down, but please correct me if I'm delirious.
I mean, I would just add that as a journalist, at a time when our profession is much maligned on both sides of the border, and in the post-Bowden and Julian Cardona era, you know, it's I think it's a sense of immense responsibility that in a very polarized, divided society, and I would say that, you know, on both sides of the border, you know, journalism has to thrive. I mean, we have to continue bearing witness. We have to continue pushing with facts and believing in truth and being transparent and just, you know, just keep going forward. I mean, the border has reached the interior of the United States in more ways than one, as well as the United States has reached Mexico and the border. And we have to, in some ways, continue being that bridge between both countries.
Yeah, that's something that Charlie writes in his foreword to Jericho, is sort of that Bowdoin was inhabited crossings, not so much borders, but crossings. And that feels that increasingly porous, you know, no matter how much the effort is to try to keep them out, right? That this is porous. And to me, I feel like it's something, we have a few minutes left, and I definitely want to touch on this a little bit, is Paco brought it up a little earlier, Bowden's love of the natural world. In some ways, it feels like he was a thwarted nature writer. He, you know, he saw things that he couldn't look away from, and that derailed, much to our benefit, I think, that derailed his plans to sort of sit back and just watch the birds and write about them. But there is, I think, you know, woven through these pieces and so much of this series, he takes things. He takes sort of the resilience that Ariana was just talking about, the resilience of the natural world. And, you know, there's all this harm and there's all this pessimism and there are bad things happening, but there's also the joy of, you know, 40 hummingbirds feeding at his feeders. And so maybe Paco, you can speak a little bit to this. You know, you mentioned the Blue Desert, you know, sort of was his third book, and it was in a lot of ways focused on the natural world. And I'd love to hear from everyone, if anyone else has anything to say to that. You know, this idea that nature writing is a separate genre that can be put in a container over here, but then, you know, to me, that also feels porous. You know, and I think Bowden's work kind of speaks to that a bit.
Yeah, Stephen, I'm glad you mentioned kind of like the issue of genre, because I know there's a lot of other writers and people involved in the writing world, and editors and people on, you know, listening to this chat, which, you know, by the way, I think like a measure of sort of like Bowden's impact on like the literary consciousness of multiple generations is another book that University of Texas Press came out with earlier this year. My sense of time is off, but America's Most Alarming Writer, which just sort of collects, you know, all of these different testimonies from writers and former editors and people who knew Chuck in a lot of different ways. And I think, you know, like a way to sort of, one thing that I think of as a way to continue Bowden's work is to, you know, be attentive to the stories that we are trafficking in from the borderlands. And I think, you know, that is an important consideration for us as writers. It's also important consideration for publishers. You know, like, what are we asking for? Like Alfredo mentions that, you know, that hungry readership that is looking for the violent story from the border. But, you know, I think the more that we sort of, you know, follow, like learn from the simultaneous attentiveness that Bowden had to the beauty, the joy, the natural world. And the more that we start to examine this violence as like not this like inherent thing, right? It's this thing that is being constantly introduced, that has long been introduced and is constantly being reintroduced into this landscape through policy, through frontier mythology, and through, you know, like this outside thirst and this outside understanding of what happens here. And so I think, yeah, just like amplifying the multiplicity of voices that comes from this place, amplifying the multiplicity of stories, and making sure that those are not always stories that are like attentive only to violence, and sort of, yeah, distress. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. If anyone else had anything to say to that, please do. Otherwise, you know, we do have a couple of audience questions here. Somebody, Wayne asks if there are what active journalists are working and writing in the fierce spirit of Bowdoin. I don't know if anybody here would have, maybe Alfredo, maybe you would have Alfredo Corchado being one.
I would say someone like Dudley Outhouse, who worked for a long time for the Wall Street Journal, the Houston Chronicle. I mean, he's had this incredible knowledge of both sides of the border, and I hate to be in that spot to name so many, because there are many on both sides of the border, but obviously we're all trying to strive to maybe to understand both sides as Julian and Charles did. Those are some big shoes to fill.
Well, maybe we're just about at an hour here, and I want to ask I feel like we could just keep talking. This is the problem, right? I want to ask maybe a quick last question of everyone. If you have a recommendation for someone who hasn't read Charles Bowden's work, if you could just recommend one thing, and it's not fair because we're here today talking about a 6-volume set of books, but I'll go first to make it easy. I'm going to say the book that my dive was Some of the Dead Are Still Breathing, which sort of, and surprisingly, when I remember reading that, I was really in a big Melville phase, and suddenly Chuck Bowden is out to sea, and I was like, whoa, this is, so that this work moves in so many ways. And you can mention more than one, you can, but if you had just one recommendation for someone.
To somebody coming absolutely cold, I would recommend The Reader. Nice cover, picture of him, but it's such a great sampling of the range of things that he can do, and I also really love Blue Desert too. So for the kind of nature part of it, although it's when I think of his work, it all seems like a single gesture, so it seems bizarre to kind of have shunt over to the side. There's nature over there, and there's the border, but those would be two that would be really topmost of my mind.
Thanks.
I just have to echo that. I think those are, the Reader is a great place to see, how wide ranging his writing can be. And then of course I mean, Blue Desert will always be my favorite because it was my introduction to his work.
What is The Laboratory of the Future? For me, hands down. It's become almost a sort of Bible for journalists. To understand these times, you have to kind of understand how we started and the whole movement towards globalization and mass migration. I mean, it's all captured there, and Julian's photos are just fantastic.
I'm sorry that we're all in such harmony. I love Juarez, The Laboratory of the Future. I turned a lot of friends onto that book. But Blue Desert was my first, so I am very faithful to that. But I also want to say these posthumous, I believe they're posthumously published memoirs, Sonata and Dakota. And is there a third in that trilogy that's posthumous? I might be a little fuzzy on.
Jericho, I think.
Jericho's was published. Yeah, they're so gorgeous. They're so gorgeous, and they really do have the sweep of all of the other books, and they're very sensorially vivid. They're full of the smell of dirt, and it's this entire series that the University of Texas has put out, the new books and the reissues, is just stunning and gorgeous, and everyone should buy the entire thing.
Agreed. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all. Like I said, I could keep talking and hearing you, such amazing insight to a writer who I've long admired and feel like I have some new perspective on after this conversation. And to everybody in the audience, I see Becky Selaton and Mary Miles there. And it's just kind of amazing to have this group of people together. Ariana, thank you for joining us late into the night on the East Coast. And gentlemen, thank you from your various corners of the world. And again, to the University of Texas Press. And this is a thrill for me. I do this for selfish reasons. I love being able to get together, even virtually, with a room of writers of this caliber. And to talk about a mutual passion like this feels kind of like a sustaining, necessary thing these days. So thank you all. And again, thanks to the audience. We appreciate you taking the time out for this.
All right.
Stephen, thank you for convening us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen.
Yeah. It was
so great to get to meet you three. I'm
so wonderful to be in conversation with you all. I hope it happens again.
All right.
Bye.
Good night.
Yeah.
Bye.